Picture this. It's roughly 40,000 years ago. You're standing in a river valley somewhere in what is now France, mammoths are wandering around in the distance, and you are a woman who just started her period with absolutely zero access to a pharmacy, zero access to a heating pad, and definitely zero access to anyone posting "just breathe through it" on the internet. So what did you do? Did you just bleed? Did the tribe hand you a leaf and say good luck? Did everyone just pretend it wasn't happening? Honestly, the answer is way weirder, way more resourceful, and in some cases way more brutal than you'd expect, and by the end of this video, you're going to look at your box of tampons like it's some kind of futuristic miracle device. Because compared to what our ancestors worked with, it basically is. Now here's the thing that trips a lot of people up right away. We tend to assume that prehistoric women were dealing with periods constantly every month, like clockwork, exactly the way a lot of modern women do. But that assumption is actually one of the biggest myths in this whole topic, and once you understand why, the entire picture of caveman period life starts to look completely different. So let's start there, because it changes everything else we're about to talk about. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Dogon in Mali, have found something fascinating. Women in these communities menstruate far less often across their lifetime than women in industrialized societies. We're talking somewhere in the range of maybe 100 periods across an entire lifetime, compared to the 300 to 400 a lot of modern women experience. That's not a small difference, that's more than double. Why? A few reasons stack on top of each other. First, these women tend to start puberty later because of diet and body fat levels. Second, they get pregnant earlier and more often relative to their reproductive years. Third, and this is the big one, they breastfeed for years, not months. And breastfeeding on demand suppresses ovulation. So a woman might go pregnant, then nurse for 2 or 3 years while barely ovulating at all, then get pregnant again shortly after weaning. String that pattern across a lifetime, and you get long stretches, sometimes literal years, where periods just don't happen. So when we imagine a Paleolithic woman, we shouldn't necessarily picture someone dealing with a monthly event her entire adult life the way it's often framed today. For a lot of prehistoric women, menstruation may have been a relatively rare event, which honestly raises the stakes even more, because rare events in small, tight-knit communities tend to become loaded with meaning. Humans are pattern-obsessed creatures. Give us something that happens occasionally that's tied to blood, fertility, and the moon cycle, and we are going to build an entire belief system around it. And that's exactly what happened. Let's talk logistics first, though, because I know that's what a lot of you are actually here for. What did they use? Archaeology doesn't hand us a lot of direct evidence here, and there's a very simple reason why. Organic materials like plant fibers, moss, and animal hide rot away over thousands of years. Stone tools survive. Bones survive. A wad of moss used 40,000 years ago does not survive, so we're largely working from indirect evidence, ethnographic comparison with recent hunter-gatherer and indigenous groups, and a healthy dose of educated inference. But when you piece it together, a picture does emerge. Sphagnum moss shows up again and again across different cultures and different eras as an absorbent material, and honestly, once you learn about this stuff, moss deserves some kind of award. It's naturally antiseptic, it's incredibly absorbent, it grows basically everywhere in temperate and northern climates, and it was used not just for menstruation but for wound dressing well into the 20th century. Indigenous groups across North America, parts of Northern Europe, and Siberia have documented histories of using moss, soft bark fibers, and dried grasses, sometimes wrapped in a layer of soft hide to hold everything together like a rough version of a pad. Animal hide itself gets used in a few different ways. Softened, worked leather could be fashioned into a kind of belt or wrap, sometimes with an absorbent material tucked inside, essentially creating a prehistoric answer to a sanitary belt system, the kind of thing that wouldn't look that unfamiliar to anyone who remembers or has read about the sanitary belts still being sold in stores as late as the 1970s. Yeah, that's right, we were using belt and pad systems shockingly recently. The gap between primitive and modern here is a lot smaller than people assume. In some desert and semi-arid environments, groups used dried plant material, things like softened bark, cattail down, or shredded grass, packed and sometimes held in place with a simple strap. In colder northern environments, groups like some Arctic indigenous communities used soft, worked skins along with absorbent mosses, and even things like rabbit fur for softness and absorbency. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people. In a lot of documented traditional societies, women may not have used any external absorbent material at all for large portions of daily activity, particularly in warmer climates, where clothing was minimal. Free bleeding, meaning managing flow without any barrier device, combined with frequent bathing in nearby rivers or water sources, was a completely normal and functional approach in a lot of environments. It sounds shocking to modern ears because we've built a culture around concealment, but if you're living semi-nomadically near a water source and your daily routine already involves regular bathing, this stops looking unusual and starts looking practical. Now let's get into the part of this topic that gets wild, because managing the physical side of menstruation is really only half the story. The other half is what people believed about it, and honestly, this is where things go from resourceful survival strategy to buckle up. Across a staggering number of unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years with no contact with each other whatsoever, you find an eerily similar idea showing up again and again. Menstrual blood is powerful. Not powerful in a nice, wholesome way necessarily, but powerful in the sense of dangerous, potent, and requiring careful handling. Some cultures treated it as sacred and linked to life-giving power, since, after all, menstrual blood is directly tied to fertility and the ability to create new humans. Other cultures treated it as something closer to contamination, dangerous to men, dangerous to hunting success, dangerous to crops. This is where we get the concept of the menstrual hut, sometimes called a moon lodge or moon hut depending on the culture and region. Groups from parts of Nepal, various indigenous communities in North America, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and indigenous Australian communities all independently developed some version of a separate structure where menstruating women would go during their period. In some cultures, this was framed as restrictive and even harmful, effectively isolating and stigmatizing women during menstruation. In others, and this is the part that tends to get left out of the popular narrative, it was framed as something closer to a retreat, a break from daily labor, a space for rest, sometimes a space where women gathered together, shared knowledge, told stories, and supported each other. Anthropologists studying some of these traditions have actually found that in certain communities, the Moon Lodge functioned less like a punishment and more like the world's earliest women's retreat, minus the essential oils and minus the Wi-Fi. There's a fascinating theory floating around in anthropology called the sex strike hypothesis, put forward by researcher Chris Knight. The basic idea goes like this. In early human societies, women may have synchronized menstrual cycles and collectively used menstruation and the taboos surrounding it as a form of leverage. Picture it as an ancient version of collective bargaining. If men wanted access to meat brought back from a hunt or wanted certain social arrangements honored, women could use the ritual significance of blood and fertility as a bargaining chip, refusing certain interactions during menstrual periods to enforce cooperation and fair distribution of resources within the group. It's a fascinating theory. It's also heavily debated, and a lot of researchers push back on it hard since it leans on some big assumptions about synchronized cycles that modern science has actually cast doubt on. That whole idea that women who live together sync up their periods, the famous dorm effect, later more. Rigorous studies with better methodology have largely failed to replicate it. So take the sex strike hypothesis as one bold, interesting idea in a field full of competing bold, interesting ideas, not settled fact. Here's another theory that connects menstruation to something you'd never expect: cave art. Some researchers, including anthropologist Terence McKenna, and separately people building on Chris Knight's work, have proposed a link between menstrual cycles, the lunar cycle, and some of the earliest evidence of human timekeeping. There are carved bones and marked artifacts, some dating back over 20,000 years, with sequences of notches that some researchers argue track lunar phases. Since the average menstrual cycle roughly parallels the lunar cycle at around 29 days, some researchers speculate that tracking the moon and tracking menstruation may have been intertwined activities, meaning some of humanity's earliest attempts at counting and recording time might be tangled up with menstrual tracking. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Now, I want to be clear, this is a speculative and contested idea in archaeology. Plenty of scholars think we're reading way too much into some notched bones. But it's a wild thought experiment regardless. The idea that the origin of calendars might partly trace back to women counting days until their next cycle? That's the kind of detail that never makes it into the history textbooks. And frankly, it should. Let's swing back to something a little more grounded, because I promised you humor, and I intend to deliver. Let's talk about ochre. Red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment, shows up constantly in the archaeological record. We're talking burial sites, cave paintings, body decoration evidence going back over 100,000 years. Archaeologists have long debated exactly why early humans were so obsessed with this reddish pigment, and one theory that keeps coming up ties directly back to our topic today. Some researchers argue that red ochre held symbolic weight specifically because of its visual resemblance to blood, including menstrual blood, and that its use in rituals, burial practices, and body painting may be connected to broader cultural beliefs about blood, life, death, and fertility, all being linked concepts in the early human mind. Basically, humans have been weirdly fascinated with the color red and its connection to blood for over 100,000 years, which honestly checks out, because modern humans are still weirdly obsessed with red. We put it on stop signs, we associate it with danger, love, passion, and warning labels simultaneously, which is a wildly confusing color to assign so many jobs to. Our ancestors were doing the exact same thing, just with rocks instead of traffic signage. Now let's talk about pain management, because periods hurting is not some modern invention, and dealing with cramps without ibuprofen sounds like an absolute nightmare. Traditional and indigenous medicine across the world developed herbal remedies specifically targeting menstrual discomfort long before modern pharmaceuticals existed. Groups have historically used things like raspberry leaf, which is still sold today as a tea marketed toward reproductive health. Willow bark, which contains a compound chemically related to aspirin, was used across multiple ancient cultures for pain relief generally, and its use for period pain specifically has been documented in various traditional medicine systems. Cramp bark, which honestly has one of the most on-the-nose names in the history of plant nomenclature, was used by several indigenous North American groups specifically as an antispasmodic for menstrual cramps. Ginger, various types of warming herbal teas, and heat therapy using warmed stones or heated sand wrapped in hide were also documented practices for soothing lower abdominal pain across different traditional cultures. That last one is clever when you think about it. Heat therapy for cramps is still recommended by doctors today: heating pads, hot water bottles, warm baths. Turns out our ancestors figured out that heat helps with cramps using nothing but a fire pit and some rocks, thousands of years before anyone invented an electric heating pad you can order with same-day shipping. Let's shift gears and talk about something that might surprise you: the social status angle. In a lot of cultures, reaching menarche, meaning a girl's first period, wasn't treated as an embarrassing secret, to be quietly managed. It was treated as a massive life event, often marked with elaborate ceremony. The Apache Sunrise Ceremony is one of the most well-documented examples of this. It's a multi-day ceremony marking a girl's transition into womanhood, following her first period, involving specific rituals, physical endurance elements, spiritual blessings, and community-wide celebration. It's still practiced today by some Apache communities, which is a pretty remarkable thread connecting directly back through countless generations. Various Aboriginal Australian communities have historically held similar first period ceremonies, often involving separation periods, teaching from older women, and formal recognition of the transition to womanhood. In parts of Africa, and among various indigenous groups in the Americas, similar rites of passage tied to menarche have been documented, often involving symbolic gifts, new clothing, or body decoration, and formal instruction from elder women about womanhood, fertility, and community responsibilities. Compare that to a lot of modern experiences of getting your first period, which for plenty of people involves whispering to a friend in a school bathroom and hoping nobody notices the toilet paper improvisation happening in there. We kind of lost something along the way, didn't we? Somewhere between the ancient world and now, a genuinely significant biological milestone that connects directly to a person's fertility and adult identity got quietly rebranded as something to hide, apologize for, and rush through as fast as humanly possible. Now, I don't want to paint this whole picture with rose-tinted glasses, because plenty of historical and even some documented recent menstrual taboos have been genuinely harmful, not empowering. In various cultures and time periods, menstruating women were barred from touching food, barred from certain religious spaces, forced into isolation that bordered on outright neglect rather than restful retreat, and in some tragic documented modern cases, specifically in parts of rural Nepal where a practice called chowpatty still occasionally occurs despite being legally banned, women have been forced into small isolated huts under unsafe conditions, sometimes with fatal consequences from exposure, smoke inhalation from fires lit for warmth, or animal attacks. So it's important to hold both truths at once. Some menstrual traditions clearly functioned as rest, community, and empowerment. Others functioned as control, restriction, and outright danger. Human cultures are complicated and inconsistent, prehistoric and otherwise, and it would be dishonest to pretend every ancient tradition was some enlightened feminist retreat when the reality is a lot messier and more varied than that. Let's zoom back out to pure survival logistics for a second, because there's a practical angle here that doesn't get talked about enough. Predators. This is one of those pieces of pop science trivia that gets repeated constantly, usually in the context of camping advice, the claim that menstrual blood attracts bears or other predators. It's actually a persistent enough belief that U.S. National Park Service literature has specifically addressed it, and the research is more nuanced than the scary campfire stories suggest. Studies specifically testing black bear responses to used tampons versus other scents found less dramatic attraction than popular belief assumes, though there's more documented concern specifically around polar bears based on limited but notable observed incidents. For early humans living directly among large predators without the luxury of a sealed tent and a bear canister, managing scent and blood exposure wasn't paranoid overthinking. It was a legitimate survival consideration, which adds another practical layer onto why disposal methods, burial of used materials, and proximity to campfires, which double as both warmth and predator deterrent, mattered so much. Speaking of disposal, this is another detail that connects surprisingly directly to spiritual belief systems across cultures. In many documented traditional societies, how you disposed of menstrual blood and used materials wasn't a casual afterthought, it was often ritualized. Some cultures required burial of used materials specifically to prevent them from being found and used in what was believed to be harmful magic against the woman, essentially an ancient fear of someone using your own blood against you, which honestly sounds like the plot of at least 3 different horror movies. Other cultures required burning materials, again tied to beliefs about preventing spiritual harm or contamination. This wasn't hygiene theater. In the belief systems of these cultures, it was taken as seriously as locking your front door is taken today. Let's bring it back to something lighter for a second, because I promised humor and we've gotten pretty heavy for a few minutes here. Let's talk about menstrual synchrony and dispel a myth while we're at it, because I mentioned earlier that the living together makes your cycles sync up idea has largely fallen apart under closer scientific scrutiny, and I want to actually explain why that matters here. The original research suggesting synchrony, a 1971 study by researcher Martha McClintock, became massively influential and got repeated constantly in pop psychology and pop anthropology for decades. The problem is that later studies with tighter methodology, controlling for the simple statistical reality that menstrual cycles naturally vary in length and will randomly overlap and separate over time regardless of any biological synchronization mechanism, largely failed to replicate the original findings. So when you hear claims about ancient communal menstrual huts existing because women's cycles naturally synced up, take that specific justification with a heavy dose of skepticism. The huts existed, that part is well documented. The biological synchronization explanation for why groups of women might menstruate around similar times is much shakier science than pop culture treats it as. Let's talk diet for a second, because this connects back to something I mentioned earlier about frequency of periods, and it's worth expanding on. Modern researchers studying the Dogon people of Mali, in a landmark long-term study by anthropologist Beverly Strassman, found something that fundamentally reshaped how scientists think about the natural number of periods a woman experiences across a lifetime. Strassman's research, conducted through direct observation over an extended period living among the Dogon, documented that women in this traditional agricultural society experienced roughly 100 menstrual cycles across their entire reproductive lifespan, compared to the 300 to 400 common in modern industrialized populations. This gap is largely attributed to earlier and more frequent pregnancies combined with extended breastfeeding periods that naturally suppress ovulation. This research has become one of the most cited pieces of evidence for the idea that the modern experience of frequent, regular menstruation across decades is actually a relatively recent development in human history, driven by modern reproductive patterns like fewer pregnancies, shorter breastfeeding windows, and improved nutrition leading to earlier puberty. In other words, your grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, going back enough generations into a purely hunter-gatherer lifestyle, may have dealt with periods way less often across her life than most people today, even though when it did happen, she had a lot less technology available to manage it. Now here's a fun one to close out the practical section. Teeth. Yes, teeth. Some archaeological and ethnographic evidence points toward chewed plant fibers, essentially softened and worked using teeth to break down tough plant material into something more pliable and absorbent, being used as an early technique for preparing menstrual materials. It sounds unusual to modern ears, but softening tough plant fiber by chewing is a documented technique used across multiple traditional crafts, including preparing materials for basket weaving and cordage. Repurposing that same fiber softening technique for personal hygiene materials isn't a stretch at all once you understand it was already a common skill in the toolkit. So where does this leave us? When you zoom all the way out, the story of how prehistoric and traditional societies handled menstruation isn't really one clean, tidy narrative. It's this incredible tangle of raw physical problem solving using moss, hide, plant fiber, chewing techniques, heat therapy, and herbal medicine to handle a completely universal biological reality. And layered right on top of that practical survival engineering is this massive, sprawling web of belief, ritual, taboo, ceremony, and social meaning that different cultures built up independently, again and again across every continent without any contact with each other, all circling around the same basic biological fact. And maybe that's actually the most interesting takeaway buried in all of this. Menstruation is one of those universal human experiences that roughly half the species has dealt with for the entire span of human history, and yet it's also one of the most historically underdiscussed, underdocumented, and frankly stigmatized topics in the entire archaeological and anthropological record. We have entire museum wings dedicated to stone tools used for cutting meat, but menstrual management technology, which was just as essential to daily survival for half the population, barely gets a footnote in most textbooks. That's not an accident, that's a direct reflection of the same discomfort and silence that a lot of modern cultures still carry around this exact topic. So the next time you're annoyed about running out of your preferred period product, or dealing with cramps and reaching automatically for a heating pad and a painkiller, it might be worth remembering there's a genuinely staggering, deep, and honestly kind of beautiful history of human ingenuity and cultural meaning-making sitting behind that completely ordinary monthly moment, stretching back not just thousands, but likely well over 100,000 years into our shared past. Our ancestors were dealing with the exact same biological reality you are, just with moss, hide, ochre, willow bark, and a whole lot of collective ritual instead of a drugstore aisle. And honestly, given what they had to work with, they figured out a shocking amount. If this kind of deep dive into the stuff history class conveniently skipped over is your thing, you know exactly what to do. Hit that subscribe button, because there is a whole lot more prehistoric human behavior we haven't even scratched the surface of yet. And trust me, some of the other topics get even weirder than this one.